I'll turn it as a question. I would like to know, and I'll discuss after, I'll put the question first. I would like to know how much the model can travel, about the external validity. You touched it at the end in the conclusion of your paper. I'm interested to know if the type of war, civil war we're seeing in Ukraine affect the impact of reporting bias, actor-centric reporting bias, in a sense that if we would witness a more fragmented civil war where it's more difficult to put on the other side in order to mobilize the other side in action or describe only one side violence. Would we see as much an effect on the selective coverage on the policy preferences? And in other words, how much the type of civil war we trying to analyze in terms of coverage impacts? So is this model as effective to understand asymmetrical conflict and the way they are covered? And if we add a layer of question, how much it is on conventional civil war that would be more fragmented and or an asymmetrical conflict that is extremely fragmented. Let's say if you think about Syria, the way we report about Syria, the different side, it is in certain places and to certain enclaves more difficult to fully assess the impact of putting the blame or the way it's framed. So I know you'll tell me that you still don't have number to assess the case, how much it's traveling. I would most likely want to know in a general feeling how much you think it traveled to an asymmetrical conflict or a fragmented conflict. Thank you.
That's a great question. I mean, scope conditions are always something to keep front and center in this type of research. The fact that this conflict is essentially two-sided. I mean, no conflict is purely two-sided here. We have to collapse all the volunteer battalions and all the different Cossack militias and their respective combatants. But that does simplify the analysis a great deal. I don't think there's anything inherent about the theoretical logic here that would not travel to a four-sided or a five-sided conflict. It would make it a lot more difficult to run these kinds of experiments because we would have to have additional boxes for additional for additional actors. But I don't think there's anything inherent about the number of actors involved that would make these kinds of effects harder to find. Because essentially what we find is that the more you know about who's committing the violence, the more likely you are to oppose them. So in a Syrian context, for instance, I mean, there are dozens of different rebel militias on the ground. The ones that we typically hear about are groups like al-Nusra, Islamic State. The Free Syrian Army, we typically do not hear very much about acts of anti-civilian violence that they commit. But there are also myriad other militias that participate in that conflict that we are less aware of, and it's hard to mobilize support against. In terms of symmetric, asymmetric, I guess you mean in terms of the balance of power or the types of weapon systems that are being used?
I would say more the balance of power, even if we start thinking about zone of control and who's reporting from. In that case, when we report from one side, it's easier to cover in a certain way and to, so it's more in that sense if we're looking in a way where the insurgency is not in control of any territory. Does it affect the way we're thinking about putting the blame or how even the baseline of OSCE would, if we reflect the same way about reporting and the biases?
Right. So I think that may matter. Where it might matter is particularly the fact that the OSCE there simplifies this analysis a great deal. There's limited access to both sides, certainly. But what I guess what really makes Ukraine an advantageous case to study here in terms of the theoretical implications of the story is not even so much the balance of power on the two sides, but the fact that the media audiences within the rebel-controlled territories, within government-controlled territories, within Russia, all live in this semi-hermetically sealed information environment, right? And it's typical. I mean, Ukraine has a lot more freedom in the press than, say, Russia or the rebel-held territories, but there's still wartime restrictions on freedom of speech. There are certain people you cannot invite on TV for an interview, right? Or you'll get your show kicked off the air. And so that, I think, is what makes what may make it more difficult to generalize from the Ukrainian case to a situation like Syria, where it's much harder, first of all, to understand what people there are listening to, what information sources they have, and also much more of that information war is directed externally to potential source of external support rather than trying to mobilize internally the support for the combatants.
Let me jump in and then we'll alternate. Yuri, but you're showing us that there is this polarization that we all know about. Is that working? Okay. And it's laid out in graphics. Essentially, the Ukrainian media is reporting what when the other is attacking, and vice versa. And the OSCE, for political reasons, is not reporting on the source. So we have an event, but rarely an information about where it's coming from. My first question is, well, first of all, the event itself. Is there a way to assess the validity that it actually happened irrespective of the source? Could events be fabricated? There's a lot of fabrication about sources. I'll get to that in a minute, but in terms of where it's coming from. But the actual event, that there is, I don't know, a missile being launched
or a child being
civilians.
crucified.
That's
Yeah.
it.
Hypothetically.
Yeah, so hypothetically, yes, absolutely, it happens, but it's very rare. And we were actually surprised by how rare the fabrication of events is, and part of the reason why it's rare is because there is no shortage of atrocities being committed by both sides, frankly. And both sides have their share of information that they can pull just from the public record, and they can put out into the press that makes the other side look bad. And so it's not so much making up events that did not happen. It's not reporting on events that did happen that make your side look bad, right?
But what about reporting on an event that happened, where clearly the source was you, let's say, as opposed to the other, but you're reporting as the other, which is different from I will only be reporting on what the other is doing to me. I'll give you just a quick example. It's pre-war. I mean, it's the beginning of violence in Donbas, March 2014, when there was a demonstration of pro-Ukraine, 10,000 people, and they were attacked by, well, at the end there were thousands. They were attacked violently by pro-Russian types coming from the occupied buildings. It was systematically reported in the Russian press as being the pro-Ukraine demonstrators attacking the pro-Russian demonstrators, not the other way around. So here's clearly a fabrication in the source, but the event did happen.
Yes, yeah. So these kinds of cases we do try to account for. So just to give you all a sense of how the data analysis works in our model. So we use the OSCE event reports as the census, as the census of events, and we track it down to the village day level. So in a given village, in a given day, if the OSCE reported an act of violence happening there, we mark that as, basically an event that is in the public record, which various media organizations on each side can then choose to report on or not. What they choose to write on it is a different story. And so if you have an event, say in Donetsk, that happened on March 14th, 2014, whatever it is, three Russian sources say the SBU did it or the Ukrainian army did it. Three Ukrainian sources say that no, it's the Russians or the rebels that did it. That averages out, at least in the aggregation model, that time series that I showed you to basically, it's a lot of uncertainty over who did it. And so from the standpoint of actor attribution, it depends on, first of all, the population of sources in your data set. If you have more Russian sources and they're all saying that it's the Ukrainians that did it, and that outweighs the Ukrainian sources that say the opposite. So from the standpoint of a data analyst who's trying to use these data to do statistical analysis and combine all these data into like one kind of gold standard set of events, There's going to be a lot of uncertainty over who committed the violence, but the average will depend on the balance of reporting in the press.
I can have a second quick question. I'm interested also in the type of violence where there's disagreement. Let's say the more important act of violence that needs to be debated in terms of impact. So if it goes on one side or it goes in another, then it might have a bigger impact on policy relevance. So can we assess through the model, because debating whether or not who is to blame about one shelling in a small village is something, debating about who is responsible of a major airstrikes on a village in, let's say, in Syria, or a major mass murder we saw in the Second World War, where there's debates about where it's coming from, or even in the Bosnian War. I would like if you can develop more about these kind of different acts of violence, and if we see a difference in terms of policy impact of the, I would say, the actor-centric reporting, and especially putting blame on someone in between the shelling and the major act.
Ironically, the more people die, the better off we are as social scientists, because there's research on this, on reporting bias and conflict, by Niels Weidmann and others, a lot of it also by Christian Davenport, going back a little bit further. And the conventional wisdom that has emerged from this previous research is that the higher intensity the event is, the more victims there are. That also means the more witnesses there will be. The more likely that event is to be covered in the press, the less uncertainty there will be over actor attribution and the tactics that were used, simply because there are simply more eyes on the problem. So in that very perverse way, reporting bias goes down as the scale of violence goes up. So, yeah, so the more extreme the tactics, ironically, the more likely they are to be covered.
Yuri, you said at the outset, why would people outside of political science care, right? And you do have a conclusion about policy, though you didn't have much time in the presentation. You argue in the paper that because of this polarization, the fact that, let's say, on the Ukrainian side, we only hear about what the other is doing, and vice versa, make it less likely to find a kind of common ground for reconciliation or conflict resolution.
Yeah, so that is one reason why we should care if we're not political scientists.
Well, how can it be remedied?
Well, it can be remedied, well, in terms of public opinion, I guess our goal here is not so much to remedy the problem. We're not activists. Our goal here is to diagnose it. Remedying the problem is the domain of Ukraine's new information ministry. The truth warriors, but I think they're already overdoing it in many ways. I think the remedy is just simply for more people to be aware of the problem and to diversify their sources of information. Wartime restrictions on freedom of press, I think, are never good. They are effective at mobilizing support for your side. In that sense, they do serve a purpose. There's been a lot of talk here about Russian propaganda, and that's certainly something that policymakers in Ukraine should worry about. But there is...
But instead of the should, let me rephrase, in terms of what we know from the literature, from the social science literature,
Right.
do we have, is there some kind of a body of cases, of evidence from previous cases that shows, well, the information landscape evolved or changed, and that was a factor in a step towards conflict resolution?
Most of the literature has pointed in the opposite direction, which is to say, using using information to incite violence. So, for example, hate radio in Rwanda. Horrible example, but that's one way in which a very extreme version of this kind of information warfare was used to incite violence. I have not seen any kind of field experiments in which the opposite effect was really achieved. We have many ways of saying what we believe are some of the negative consequences. Logically, the solution to that is if policy X produces a bad outcome, then not X will produce a less bad outcome. That's kind of our logic here. We do not obviously have the ability to test that directly.
All right, so we'll move to Jesse's presentation, and later on we'll have a general discussion.
I would like you to discuss more about, I think, the Bosnian case and the idea of the stalemate, and when we reach it after 3 years of a brutal civil war is a good example to compare with Ukraine, and particularly because we had the P5 or others have incentive in Bosnia. They could use could use strategic airstrikes. They can force Serbs to come to the negotiation table. We don't have many incentive here, and especially when you talk about the fat rabbits, as long as the rabbits remains very fat, there's absolutely no reason where a Dayton Accord can be even close to be imposed. The fat rabbit that you have actually goes way better than what we can offer in terms of a Dayton Accords that we're giving rather a big fat rabbit for the Republika Srpska. So and it's a bit depressing the way you're showing it. When I'm listening to you, I feel that if we don't get France on board, and I do believe that France is a better option, for sure China is probably not the better option to enter here as peacekeeping.
Well, they just wouldn't do it. I mean, the argument with China, I mean, leaving aside that it would not be a good option, it's just, because this is your garbage, Europe. I mean, like, China really has its own problems, I mean, they would never say it like that. They just wouldn't say anything. They would just stare at you, I think. Yeah. Once it's settled, they'll invest. Like, once everything is settled, I'll bet you'll have Chinese casinos in there. But like, that's a really different conversation than being the lead state on the UNSC. They're interested in their own sphere of influence.
Mm-hmm. So, if we think about France, can the Anglophone countries and or Russia give incentive to break the collective action dilemma for France to get involved? And what kind of incentive could we reach where France could produce a result that goes over the equilibrium that we would see in terms of a Dayton Accord?
Yeah, so it's straightforward. The rabbits don't get thinner until Russia disarms the Donbas. So Russia has to be involved in the settlement, but that's, we know that already. Mm-hmm. They have to be involved in the settlement because they have a veto in the P5 of the Security Council, right? Like, we use the metaphor of a veto player in political science a lot because everyone knows what it means. But in this case, we're talking about a literal institution where they literally have a veto. So their preferences will be met no matter what, in some way. And one manifestation of that is that they're the obvious actor. They're the only actor that could disarm the Donbas. It's sort of like if it's hard to think of an analogy in the United States that would make sense, actually. But if this war were taking place if there was a civil war in Mexico and there were a lot of people in Tijuana, China's not going to disarm Tijuana, even if China is funding bunch of stuff in Mexico City, which we would never let them do because it's our sphere of influence. But if you allow yourself to sort of go there, obviously the United States has to do that as part of the settlement. So that's how you get the rabbits thin. The question of what NATO can do proactively is harder. It might be that the best that NATO can do is to be the bad cop off stage, who's complaining about how what they really, really want is more than we're, whoever we are, is getting at the negotiating table, while France is actually negotiating at the negotiating table. Mm-hmm. And what it would sound like for those of us who are listening to Yuri's biased media is the United States and Great Britain, constantly complaining about how we're abandoning Ukraine for years and years and years at a time. All we would hear is abandoning Ukraine. I can't believe we abandoned Ukraine. What is this going to do to our credibility? How can we even make commitments in the world anymore? It's such a tragedy. And we would just be assaulted with that from both political wings of both political parties. It would be abandonment.
Jesse, short of the French miracle,
I'm holding out hope.
Presentation sounds very much like there is an impasse here. There's like a stalemate, right? Otherwise known as frozen conflict, but frozen doesn't mean that the guns are frozen. The guns are still very hot, but it's again, in comparative terms, relatively low intensity conflict, meaning there's still soldiers, mostly combatants, very few civilians since Minsk II, being killed on a weekly basis. The front is not moving, they're shooting at each other.
Yeah.
But that's not Hobesian, and that's not even, certainly not summer 2014 or January 2015 before Minsk II. So it could go on. It could go on, it could go on. And again, short of that kind of resolution that you expounded here involving France, what else could happen? What other pathways could develop besides the relatively traditional, now in post-Soviet conflicts and post-Soviet studies, frozen conflicts?
So, I mean, one thing that I think could develop is a sort of a principled standoff that escalates in a conventional way between the West and Russia, broadly constructed here. I don't think the West is an actor. You know, I think this is part of why it's useful to talk about France, because France is, you know, there's a government there, there's an actor there. But speaking in broad brushstrokes, if you imagine a future of confrontation, military escalation, where rather than the analogy of a frozen conflict, and we're thinking about Abkhazia in the back of our minds, have a frozen conflict and think about West-East Germany in the back of our minds. Or think about the DMZ in North Korea in the back of our minds. That's relatively scary to me and very plausible to me, that this becomes a place where, you know, over many generations, like human generations, the West slowly, through a lot of decentralized efforts, many of which we can already see kind of beginning, throws a lot of foreign aid into Ukraine and builds a Ukrainian state that is de facto in Western security structures. Russia complains about it bitterly, and then there's some crisis in Russia, and all of a sudden we realize that we have this flashpoint that is an actual flashpoint in a way that Abkhazia and South Ossetia aren't. So that's one scenario. You could imagine a conventional escalation scenario there. Another scenario is you start getting more depressing or more utopian, like past that. I mean, you can have the really depressing scenarios involve irregularization. And by irregularization, we should maybe know what we're talking about. What I mean is that the actions of terrorists on one side or the other or both start forcing the other side to engage in counterinsurgency type behaviors. And in that setting, it's really hard to know what would happen, but it's relatively easy to imagine lots and lots and lots of death. And my favorite personal scenario for how this happens, not favorite in a normative sense, but just something that keeps me up at night, is Western Ukrainian democratic secession in the Slovakia model. It's really not clear to me what would stop them from doing that. What would stop, like, so let's say the conflict goes on for 15 years, and it's clear that they're not getting into NATO because it's blocked by all of this Eastern nonsense. Like, we're not getting, because of Article 5, we can't extend NATO to Russia, so this conflict is still frozen and we're still not in NATO. That you would have a political movement that basically does what the Slovenes did. And no one ever blames the Slovenes for Bosnia, right? No one ever winds the clock all the way back to the breakup of Yugoslavia, to the Slovenian departure, you know, because only 20 people died. And so, like, that way of thinking about this conflict, I have to admit, it was raised for me. I did not think this up myself. It was raised for me by a Ukrainian intellectual when I was in Kiev in the summer of 2014. And he drew this map for me. And in his map, Russia's the bad guy because, you know, this was information warfare in Kiev in 2014. You know, he's telling stories where Russia's the bad guy. But, you know, in his story, Russia seizes the whole North Shore of the Black Sea in response to some, humanitarian crisis. They're calling it Novorossiya. They're greeted as liberators, kind of, but there's an irregular war. In response to that, you know, because we're forced to, the Western Ukrainians democratically secede. But notice that leaves behind this massive rump state, sea, where millions of people live. And in that rump state, it's not really clear what would happen, and my guess is that we would revert to Hobbesian logics. So that's a really depressing, long answer,
Yeah,
but let me just say two utopian
It's
ideas.
almost entertaining, but you realize that it totally contradicts the evidence that Victoria presented this morning.
Oh,
that
yeah.
actually Western Ukraine is getting closer to central Ukraine.
Everybody
Yeah.
be cool is what I
Yeah.
would say,
Yeah.
is that the evidence that Victoria presented this morning is only 2 years into this, and my scenario, my nightmare scenario, is 15 years out, when all of the optimism has passed. And if it stays frozen for that long, then the data that Victoria gave us, it's not that I doubt her data, it's that, the Georgians feel really different today than they did in 1995. About what conflict resolution was going to look like, and let's give it time. The two nice scenarios, like the utopian good scenarios, involve the West, again, whoever that is, massively compromising on its ideal point and just turning the whole thing over to Russia, or Russia doing the opposite. And the sort of thought experiment that most people use to get there is that, well, as soon as Putin gets hit by a bus, that's going to happen. Let's just get regime change in Russia, and then, bam, conflict resolution, because this whole problem is due to Putin. I think that is naive and dangerous to the extreme. I think that the idea that the first thing that the next government in Russia does is give Crimea back is absurd on face. So, that's just my opinion. I'm just making stuff up here. But it does inform a lot of U.S. foreign policy, that what we really need to do is wait for a new regime in Russia, and then finally we can solve Ukraine. I think that is, unfortunately, I don't agree with the implications of that.
On this provocative note, we'll field questions from the audience. We'll start with Hannah.
Thanks a lot, Dominic. First, a very short remark to what Yuri said. Luckily, there are good examples when media was used for the reconciliation on the ground level mostly, and the search for common ground is working a lot, and Nepal and African conflicts have a lot of examples. So if you would like, it's easily to search for them for the last 15 years. But my question for you would be about did you make any correlation about the possibility of manipulation in this news? It's not only about lie and truth, when you were comparing, because let's say terrorists or fighters, it is labeling. It's not truth or lie. But in the news, you can have manipulation by the synonyms, by the adjectives, by the use of the information, and so on. So in your research, were you looking at these subjective elements? And also to Jesse.
One at a time. Mm-hmm. We'll start with Yuri.
Right, and so by manipulation, you mean the tone of the report or the content?
Both, because, for example, Crimea always was a part of Russia. It is manipulation because it's been only for, let's say, 200 years. So you can't say that Crimea is not Russian, but it has never been. So then things like this.
Yes, well, the way that we code these reports is I think, in too narrow a way to catch these types of nuances. Because we code these reports in an actor-action-target framework. So the only things that we're picking up here is the actor committing the violence, the type of violence they're using, and who the target is. To the extent that the type of manipulation that you mentioned is consistent within a source, we have separate what are called training sets or training data for each of these sources. So for each data source, we have a team of undergraduates that read a randomly selected subset, put it into categories, and then we train a machine learning algorithm to then detect the same kinds of patterns. And so obviously you can't use, say, a training set based on a data source that calls DNR terrorists to then predict events in a Russian source that uses maybe terrorists to describe the Ukrainian armed forces, right? You get completely different results. And so the way we get around that is by simply coding a separate training set for each source. I mean, to the extent that there are other types of manipulations, historical inaccuracies, that's outside the scope of what we're doing. We're basically just looking at who did what to whom, when and where.
Thank you. And to Jesse, don't you think that when you want to speak about the conflict resolution, and if we are in the academic seminar, we need to be accurate with the terms and terminology. First of all, calling the events in Ukraine the civil war, in this case, you're going to the completely different conflict resolution pattern than as soon as you understand who are the parties to the conflict. And also when you're speaking about peacekeeping, honestly, I had quite a strange feeling about what you're talking about, the peacekeeping or about the peacemaking or about what kind of, because you can speak about France, you can speak about Permanent Five, but as soon as you don't understand what functions, what mandate you attribute to this mission, where it should be stationed and so on, it doesn't matter who will be the soldiers or civilians in this mission, because you just don't understand what functions and what you would like from this mission on the ground.
I think I understand the terms I'm using just fine. When I say the mandate, that's what's being bargained over. The language of the mandate in the UN Security Council is what is being bargained over. When I say the troops that actually go in and do the stuff, there is always a lead state that actually governs the, okay, so there's two different kinds of UN blue hats. You have a large number of soldiers that basically are from Bangladesh and from Jordan, and there are some governments that it costs about $2 per day to equip these soldiers. Then there's these other soldiers that it costs like $200 a day to equip, and that's the low end. We need the latter kind, at least in some numbers, to do rescue operations, to get our NGOs out if they get kidnapped. And we need to make sure that the UN resolution that mandates all of them being there in the first place is like okay by the government that's going to do that. And if you don't get all of that pretty much agreed to, at least implicitly up front, you don't get a UN Security Council resolution to begin with. Now, believe me, I really do understand the distinction between peacekeeping and peacemaking, and a lot of other people do too. I wrote a whole book about what peacekeeping looked like in Tajikistan, what peacekeeping looked like in Georgia, and part of the problem, it is really a problem, I'm not saying this to celebrate it, it is a problem that we know a little bit too much about what it looks like when Russia is the lead state. Like, nobody can take seriously the idea that 30 years from now, Ukraine, if it is rebuilt by Russia, is going to be the kind of place where a lot of Ukrainians feel grateful that it was rebuilt by Russia. Now, they will be expected to feel grateful, and you'll have some class that will say that they are feeling grateful, but it's difficult emotionally for people in the West, the more they study the post-Soviet Civil War resolutions in the early 1990s, to feel like allowing Russia to be the lead state is anything other than abandonment. But believe me, I understand the terms just fine. So maybe you weren't trying to, escalate this, but I study this.
Thank you. So Jennifer Carroll from Brown. My question is for Jesse. So I've been hearing a number of people, especially Alexander Motul recently, offering this sort of unsolicited advice and marching orders for Ukraine about how to turn this around. And a lot of it has focused on, within this sphere of discussion, forget about Donbas, focus on Ukraine, pass, anti-corruption laws, improve the quality of life, blah, 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 make everyone so happy, and then just make the people in the DNR, LNR want to be back in Ukraine. So it's essentially this kind of sort of hearts and minds argument. Yeah. Now, I know that you said earlier in your presentation that you were specifically looking at top-down things, but do you think that there is, do we live in a universe in which there is a possibility for a bottom-up sort of mechanism to change things, or is this just a lot of wishful thinking?
Yeah, no, I'm really optimistic that the wishful thinking has a real backbone to it. It's not captured in my model terribly well. But I love the idea that Western aid is actually more efficacious than aid from other countries, not just because it's being stolen cynically, but because we're actually doing better stuff. And so it's not just that the stag, to go back to the analogy, it's not just that the stag gets fatter when it's Western aid doing it, but it's that it's a better stag, and like, so that's bottom up type stuff. So I don't want to pretend like I'm not biased here. I am a liberal, and I mean, part of the problem in this conversation is that there's almost no way in the Anglophone world or the Francophone world to talk about this sort of stuff without alienating Russia. That like the more we talk through this, the more we're saying, yeah, but it's great when we do it, and we're like actually not that crazy about how it is when you rebuild it. And the Russian position is twofold. It's that, well, you guys have a lot more money than us, stop celebrating that fact, which is like a reasonable starting point. And the second is you don't actually care about these people. You just want them for your cheap labor markets. It's a pretty good 1-2 punch, like from Russian elites. So it's in public diplomacy. But the second part of my answer is like a public diplomacy answer. The first part of my answer, I'm totally with you. I want the dolphin training too. I keep making fun of that because it's like such an easy like caricature of something to make fun of. But I mean, I fund that stuff. I like that stuff. I think we need more midwives running around war zones. I do. We just need to protect them.
Thank you for presentations. My question about resolution to conflict in Ukraine, and you mentioned variety of actors and scenarios, but one I would ask about the role of European Union, and specifically European Union offered membership to Cyprus, and specifically, and also to all ex-Yugoslavia states, specifically, or in large part, in order to resolve conflicts. There are violent conflicts similar to conflicts what we had in Ukraine, internal conflicts, because otherwise Russia would never allow military defeat of separatists in Donbas, as it did in Moldova or South Ossetia or Abkhazia. Thank you. So I just want to ask if such scenario possible for Ukraine or not.
So, I mean, part of why I think France is a good lead actor is that it would be France acting on behalf of the European Union, but you know, the truth is that the European security community is a lot of hat and not a lot of cattle. This could fix that. You know, this could be, over the next 15 years, an opportunity for NATO to become what I think a lot of people in the West would like it to be, which is kind of a postmodern democracy club and not something that is encircling Russia. But, you know, credibly making that happen would require reforming NATO. So from my bliss point as an American, I would love it, if more European countries paid more for their national defense, and if we had a French Supreme Allied Commander of NATO. And maybe that NATO would be more palatable as a security guarantor in Russia. I mean, it would be sort of NATO merged with the European Union. But in my sense, the European Union will have to fund things, and they have every interest in doing that long term. But that's an economic arrangement, and the security arrangements are what the UN Security Council handles.
Anthony Butts, DIY country director. So, question for you, Jesse. So the fat rabbits thing.
Yeah.
So the thing is that you would need to. It's relatively cheap for Russia to keep these rabbits fat, right? So whereas it's very expensive for France or whoever to sort of put in enough money to make, you know, your V-star, the sort of overall worth of the country that will be divided up amongst
a whole bunch of oligarchs who are not
a whole
in
bunch
the
of
Donbas,
oligarchs, all the civilians, all the sort of people that need payoff. I mean, we're talking lots more money than to feed a couple of fat rabbits, right?
Yeah.
So it's relatively easy for Russia to veto anything Europe does, and so long as Russia feels as though it has some kind of nice leverage, having the Donbas, it may as well keep it, right? So, sort of considering all that, is it realistic that the Donbas situation will ever get resolved and won't just be another, you know, nice little bargaining point? Why would Russia ever give it away?
Well, I don't have a particularly good answer to that question, to be honest with you. I don't think that they, and this is, you know what? I'm actually just going to refuse to answer the question, Anthony. And I don't mean that in a bad way. I just, like, at this point we are mass psychologizing what Russians want, and you know, versus or what Putin wants.
How about economic cost? Just the economic cost of de facto sustaining Donbas.
Oh, it's very small. I agree with the premise of the question, which is part of why I sympathize with why you're asking it. What does it cost them to subsidize the Donbas? You know, we're talking about gas, which they have already. You know, we're talking about pensions, which they have already. We're talking about food supplies. You know, what I know from the economics of Abkhazia is that you have these middlemen who figure out very quickly how to make all kinds of money off of smuggling, and those are somehow the guys you'd need to buy off. So it's not the poor, suffering civilians. It's these brokers in the middle who have figured out that cigarette smuggling is how you make money off the EU.
But that's a completely different issue here. The issue is just sustaining the subsidy, the de facto subsidy of the entire apparatus of Donbas.
It's not a very
for a long time.
It's yeah. So the costs are low for them to do that relative to the cost of doing other things that Russia does as a matter of course. Does that answer your question directly?
The costs are low.
The costs are low.
On top of the cost of Crimea, everything is low.
We're not if you want to bring Crimea into the conversation.
Well, I mean, there's also additional costs. I mean, they're obviously
Yeah, no. Okay, now I understand what you're talking about. I'm
Yeah.
sorry. Yeah, all right, good. This is different. I was in a DNR subsidy headspace. If you look at the whole costs of the conflict to Russia, I think that there's the jury is out. I don't think there's a lot of great evidence that the targeted sanctions regime that the United States has led has really hit these guys in a way that we hoped it would. And what's really hit these guys is the global decline in oil prices. Unfortunately, they blame that on, in terms of the hermeneutically sealed media outlet, the global oil prices. That was the West. It's not OPEC. You know, the United States did that, and so the fact that you can't afford, you know, tea and cheese, that's the United States, and so it may have strengthened Putin's hand domestically. And the reason we did the sanctions were to make it costly. So, I mean, it's not that there aren't costs to what they've done. It's that whether those costs are sufficient to make them want to give up what they worry they're giving up with a Western rebuilt Ukraine. I mean, those costs may totally be worth it. They really don't want a Western rebuilt, NATO-integrated Ukraine. If you think about all of this as nation states that are great powers communicating in the only language that they know the other side understands, Russia has been saying we don't want NATO in Ukraine in absolutely clear speech for years. And after the Bucharest Declaration, they feel like they're just being ignored. Okay? So...
But regimes...
So how costly is it, Dominique? I mean, I don't know, man. Like, the risk of nuclear war is much higher than it used to be. That's a real cost, right? It's like hard to measure that cost.
Whoa, slow down, slow
All
down.
right,
Regimes are not eternal, okay?
Okay.
The expectation of regime change, that Putin will go, can be pipe dream for Western policymakers, fine. But at some point, Putin will no longer be around. We don't know what this point will be, but regimes are not eternal. So the question is, because when you keep talking about Russia, they,
That's right.
NATO, right? But Russia's position on NATO, narrative on NATO is very different in the early 90s, let's say under Yeltsin. The question is that it is...
I think that has something to do with, I mean, a perception that NATO may have like told some little white lies. I mean, I think that if... No. I understand your question.
The question is, wouldn't it be conceivable or plausible at some point down the road, since you're basically projecting really far ahead here, that in a post-Putin regime, however, you know, in whatever shape it will be, that the political and economic cost of sustaining Donbas, which is a black hole financially, will be deemed just too much, and that will change the dynamics of conflict, potential conflict resolution.
Absolutely. I think that is totally possible, and I hope for it.
So should we end on this cheerful note? Except that it's far away. We don't know. All right.
And it doesn't involve Crimea. That's the other sticking point here that nobody wants to talk about.
All right. We'll have to leave it at that. I will thank the panel.